In a laboratory in 2001, a genetic analyst held up a printout of sequencing results from a sample that had been dead for approximately 300 years. The sample was mitochondrial DNA, maternal lineage, extracted from a molar pulled from a burial site beneath the streets of Lower Manhattan. The analyst ran the sequence against a global database. The system returned its best match. And it wasn't the Gulf of Guinea. It wasn't Senegal or Ghana or the stretch of coastline that British and Dutch slave traders had called the Gold Coast. Nobody told those bones where to point, but they pointed somewhere unexpected. That finding, repeated across dozens of samples, building into a pattern that was impossible to dismiss, is why scientists are still arguing about what it means, and why it changes nearly everything we thought we understood about who built this city. This is the story of a burial ground that was erased so completely that an entire metropolis forgot it existed. And then, when the science finally caught up to the silence, what it found underneath wasn't just history. It was a rewriting. Stay with this, because the ending is not what anyone expected, and neither is the middle. Here's what every American history class teaches. The transatlantic slave trade moved people from West Africa, from the Slave Coast, the Gold Coast, coast of present-day Senegal and Ghana and Nigeria, across the Atlantic and into the Americas. This is true. It's documented in shipping records, in customs manifests, in the letters of merchants who never thought of themselves as villains. It's in the DNA of millions of African Americans alive today who take consumer ancestry tests and see results pointing to the Gulf of Guinea. That part of the story is not wrong. But the oldest surviving black burial ground in America is telling a different version. Not a contradiction, a complication, a layer the history books skipped. Because a significant portion of the people buried beneath what is now Lower Manhattan didn't come directly from Africa to New York. They came from somewhere in between, and that detour changed their genetics in ways that modern sequencing can now trace 300 years later with startling precision. The African burial ground occupies a small, quiet patch of land at the corner of Duane Street and Broadway, in the oldest neighborhood in New York City. Today it's a national monument, a grove of crepe myrtles, a polished granite memorial, a fountain. But between approximately 1690 and 1794, it was something else entirely. It was the only place in colonial New York where black people, enslaved and free, were permitted to bury their dead. Within the walls of the city, church cemeteries refused them. The civic burial grounds refused them. The dead, like the living, were subject to segregation in the city that called itself the gateway to the New World. The burial ground covered roughly 6.5 acres. In a city where land was already being contested, already being carved up by the successors of the Dutch West India Company, that was a substantial concession to people who held no political power whatsoever. Conservative estimates, and the word conservative is doing a lot of work here, suggest that somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 individuals were buried on that land over its century of active use. 10,000 to 15,000. What was actually excavated in 1991 and 1992, 419 individuals. 419 out of potentially 15,000, and those are just the people they found. The vast majority of the site is still sealed beneath federal buildings, beneath modern infrastructure, beneath a city that built itself on top of the forgotten. The burial ground was closed in 1794. The Common Council of New York ordered it shut. The city needed the land. Manhattan's population was growing. Streets were being laid. Real estate was becoming valuable. The ground that had held the dead of an entire community was quietly folded into the city's expansion plan. And within a generation, the streets above it had new names. The buildings rising on it had new owners, and almost nobody remembered what was underneath. For 196 years it was gone, not destroyed, not excavated, not honored. Simply paved over, forgotten, and built into a city that preferred not to think about the conditions under which it had been constructed. Then, in October of 1991, a construction crew began excavating the foundation for a new federal office building at 290 Broadway. The project had been approved. The permits were in order. The General Services Administration, the federal agency overseeing the build, was on schedule. And then the backhoe hit something approximately 6 feet below street level. The crew stopped. An archaeologist was called. Within days, it was clear they had found the burial ground. What the GSA did next would become a defining scandal in American preservation history. They decided to continue. The project was important. The budget was committed. The remains would be documented and the construction would proceed. It was presented as a reasonable bureaucratic decision. It was not received as one. The response was immediate and fierce. New York City's black community, residents, scholars, religious leaders, elected officials, demanded a halt. Emergency congressional hearings were called. Mayor David Dinkins, New York's first black mayor, threw his full support behind the preservation effort. Community organizations held vigils outside the construction site in the cold. The pressure mounted until it could no longer be absorbed. The GSA relented, construction paused. A full archaeological excavation was ordered. And over the following months, under the direction of professional archaeologists, 419 individuals were carefully recovered, documented, and transferred to Howard University in Washington, D.C. 1991, a backhoe, 300 years of history, surfaced in one afternoon. What came next was not a rescue project. It was a research program of a scale and ambition that had never been attempted for an enslaved population anywhere in the world. The remains were placed in the care of Howard University's W. Montague Cobb Research Laboratory, under the scientific directorship of Dr. Michael Blakey, a biological anthropologist who would spend the next decade leading what became known as the New York African Burial Ground Project. Blakey made several decisions that were unconventional in academic archaeology. He insisted that the community, the descendants, the activists, the people who had fought for this site, would be genuine partners in interpretation, not passive recipients of findings. He insisted that the full range of analysis, genetic, osteological, isotopic, historical, would be applied to every individual. And he insisted that nothing would be published until the community had been consulted. This is not how these projects usually work. The DNA work took years longer than planned, partly because the technology was advancing faster than anyone could have anticipated. Ancient DNA extraction from 18th century bones preserved in urban soil is extraordinarily difficult. The molecules degrade, they get contaminated. Getting clean sequences requires patience, precision, and equipment that barely existed when the project began. But the team pushed, and what the sequencing revealed overturned assumptions that had been embedded in the historical record for generations. First, the African origins of these individuals were real, but far more geographically diverse than anyone predicted. The mitochondrial haplogroups, which trace maternal lineage through the female line, did not cluster around West Africa the way the dominant late slave trade narrative would suggest. They spread wide. There were sequences matching populations in the Bight of Benin, sequences matching the Bight of Biafra, sequences pointing to Central Africa, to the Congo Basin, to populations in what is now Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, to peoples whose role in the Atlantic slave trade was enormous but whose presence in the American identity story was almost never told. These were not simply West Africans. They were people drawn from a vast and varied continent through a net that reached much further than the textbooks showed. The simplest version of the story was always a simplification. These people proved it. Second, some of the genetic signatures didn't match any specific African population in the pattern a direct Atlantic crossing would produce. Instead, they matched frequencies more typical of Atlantic Creole communities. People who had already been living under slavery in the Caribbean for a generation or more before being transported again, this time to New York. This was not contamination of the samples, this was biography. It was the genetic trace of a practice that colonial-era merchants called seasoning. Enslaving people in Barbados or Jamaica first, where mortality was so high that only survivors were considered worth the investment of a second ocean crossing. Many of the people beneath Lower Manhattan had crossed the Atlantic before they ever arrived in New York. Their DNA preserved the route. Third, the physical evidence confirmed what the genetics suggested. Dental enamel forms in childhood and locks in a chemical record of the water and food of wherever a person grew up. Isotope analysis of the enamel from individuals in the burial ground showed that a significant portion had not spent their early years in North America. The ratios pointed to the Caribbean, to West Africa, to places where the geology and the water were different. Their childhood was elsewhere. Their death was here. Fourth, a portion of the remains carried haplogroups associated with European maternal ancestry. These individuals were buried in the African burial ground. By every measure of their lives and communities, they were black. They were enslaved or had been enslaved. Their lived identity was African. But their mitochondrial DNA traced back to European women somewhere in the chain of generations. This is the genetic record of sexual violence, of coerced reproduction, of the documented, deliberate practice by slaveholders across the colonial Americas of assault, exploitation, and forced birth. The bones don't soften this. They document it directly. Each finding, taken alone, is remarkable. Together, they constitute something close to a complete rewrite of what we thought we knew about the people who built colonial New York. The preliminary findings circulated within the scholarly community while the full analysis was still underway. By the mid-1990s, historians and genealogists were already revising their models of the colonial slave trade in the northeastern United States. The picture that was emerging was not a clean line from a coast in Africa to a port in New York. It was a network, brutal, involuntary, deliberately designed to maximize profit and minimize the humanity of every person caught inside it, that stretched across the entire Atlantic world. People were moved from Senegambia to Barbados, from Barbados to Cuba, from Jamaica to South Carolina, from South Carolina to New York. At every step, records were incomplete or deliberately falsified. At every step, identity was stripped and replaced with a legal status, property. The DNA was the only record that survived intact. For African American families using genealogical research to trace their origins, and by the 2000s, that had become a mass cultural phenomenon, fueled by television programs and consumer DNA kits. The findings from the burial ground had profound implications. Looking for roots in Ghana or Senegal was not wrong, but the complete picture might also run through Kingston, through Bridgetown, through the ledgers of Caribbean planters, who considered it economically rational to ship their older enslaved laborers north rather than feed them through years of declining productivity. The ancestors were wherever the trade reached, and the trade reached everywhere. When President George W. Bush signed the proclamation designating the site a national monument in 2006, the first federal monument in the United States dedicated specifically to the memory of enslaved African Americans. The science had already changed the conversation in universities, in museums, in genealogy centers, and in the growing field of African American public history. On October 4, 2003, the 419 individuals finally came home. After more than a decade at Howard University, measured to the millimeter, analyzed to the molecule, documented in ways no enslaved person in colonial America had ever been documented in life, the remains were placed in hand-carved mahogany coffins crafted by artisans in Ghana. Each coffin was marked with adinkra symbols, symbols of strength, of remembrance, of the journey. Each bore an inscription for all those who were lost, all those who were stolen, all those who were left behind. The procession moved through the streets of Lower Manhattan. Thousands of people lined the route. Drummers walked alongside the coffins, libations were poured. There was singing, and there were tears, and there was a silence between the musicians that felt older than the city itself. One by one, the coffins were lowered back into the earth, into the city that had buried them and forgotten them, and built over them, and finally, after 3 centuries, chosen to remember. 300 years between one burial and the next. But the project has not ended the disagreements. And the fault lines are not where most people expect them to be. Some within the African American community have expressed genuine discomfort with the findings, particularly the evidence of European maternal ancestry. For families who have spent generations anchoring their identity in an unbroken connection to Africa, the idea that genetic records could partially complicate that narrative lands as something close to an additional wound. These are not unreasonable feelings. They come from people who have had their histories weaponized before, used to diminish rather than to illuminate. And the DNA findings have been weaponized too, in some quarters, invoked by bad faith commentators to suggest that African Americans are not genuinely African, which is not what the science says and not what any of the researchers involved have ever argued. On the other side, there are scholars who believe the most important findings, the Central African lineages, the Congolese and Angolan haplogroups, the evidence of forced transit through the Caribbean, have been systematically underemphasized in public communication about the project. That the clean, emotionally satisfying version of the story exerts such cultural pressure that even academics soften the more disruptive findings to avoid conflict. That the real history is more uncomfortable than the version displayed in museums. The DNA doesn't resolve this. It shows what happened in the language of molecules and leaves the meaning to the humans arguing over it. No side wins cleanly. The site at 290 Broadway is quiet most days now. Visitors come and stand at the memorial. They run their hands over the granite. They read the regional names carved into the stone, names of African peoples and communities, not individual names because most of those are irretrievably gone. School children come in groups. Tourists come in pairs. Beneath their feet, thousands of people are still waiting. Most of them, the vast majority, still sealed under the city that doesn't know they're there. The research continues. New sequencing technologies, developed in the years after the original Howard University project, allow researchers to extract ancient DNA at resolutions that were unimaginable in 2001. Teams are returning to samples too degraded for the earlier analysis. New haplogroup identifications, new regional matches, new threads in the web of forced migration that the Atlantic world spent 3 centuries pretending was simple. The ground is not finished speaking. 419 people, whatever their real names were, wherever they were truly born, however many times they crossed an ocean they never asked to cross, spent 300 years beneath a city that preferred not to know they were there. And then, in the span of a single generation, they became the most thoroughly studied population of enslaved people in the history of this continent. They carried a record in their own bones. Nobody asked them to. It survived anyway. Next. In 1998, marine biologists declared a reef system in the Indian Ocean biologically dead, bleached, collapsed beyond recovery. 25 years later, something is growing back at a rate that no model predicted, and the explanation for why is still being argued about in the literature.